What most Americans don't realize is that when Donald Trump publicly demanded $2.8 trillion in what he called overdue compensation from Canada last week, he wasn't negotiating. He was exposing the institutional collapse of American economic diplomacy in the starkest terms possible. And Mark Carney's three-word response, which has now been viewed over 50 million times across social platforms, didn't just go viral because it was clever. It went viral because it crystallized something that serious people on both sides of the border have been thinking for months, but haven't been willing to say out loud. When I look at this moment as someone who spent decades inside Republican institutions, what concerns me most is not Canada's response, but Washington's complete failure to understand how power actually works in the 21st century. Because this wasn't diplomacy. This was a shakedown dressed up as trade policy. And the fact that it backfired so spectacularly tells us everything we need to know about where American influence really stands today. Let me walk you through what actually happened here, because the surface story you've been hearing misses the deeper institutional crisis that this moment represents. And once you see the full picture, Carney's response stops looking like a quip and starts looking like a masterclass in how serious countries handle pressure from increasingly unserious partners. The official version of events sounds almost routine if you've been following trade tensions over the past few years. Trump, speaking at a private fundraiser in Mar-a-Lago, claimed that decades of trade imbalances, resource agreements, and what he called sweetheart deals had cost the United States $2.8 trillion in lost wealth. He demanded immediate compensation from Canada, threatening severe economic consequences if Ottawa refused. The number itself was presented without documentation, without methodology, and without any reference to existing trade frameworks that both countries have operated under for decades. From Trump's perspective, this was strength in action, America finally demanding what it was owed from a smaller neighbor that had been taking advantage for too long. The logic, if you can call it that, was simple. Canada needs access to American markets more than America needs Canadian resources. Therefore, pressure applied correctly would force compliance. It's the same assumption that has guided his approach to every international relationship for years now. The problem is that this logic only works if your assumptions about dependence and leverage are actually correct. And in this case, they weren't just wrong. They were catastrophically wrong in ways that reveal how little Trump and his advisors understand about the economic relationship they've been trying to reshape through threats and ultimatums. Because when Carney was asked about the demand during a press conference in Ottawa, he didn't deliver a long speech about Canadian sovereignty or trade law or historical precedent. He didn't get defensive or angry. He simply looked directly into the camera and said three words that every serious economist, trade lawyer, and diplomatic professional immediately understood, even if the political class took longer to catch up. Show your work. Those three words, delivered with the kind of calm authority that comes from actually understanding how modern economies function, didn't just demolish Trump's claim. They exposed the entire intellectual framework that produced it. Because when you demand $2.8 trillion from a trading partner, you're not just making a political statement, you're making a mathematical one. And mathematics, unlike politics, requires proof. This is where the story moves from embarrassing to dangerous, because what happened next reveals how American institutions have been hollowed out in ways that go far beyond individual competence or character. When Canadian officials requested the analysis behind Trump's figure, the response from Washington wasn't evidence. It was evasion. The Treasury Department cited ongoing review. The Commerce Department pointed to classified methodologies. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office claimed the calculations were proprietary. In other words, there was no work to show. The $2.88 trillion figure was not the product of economic analysis. It was the product of political theater designed to sound authoritative without being substantive. And that distinction matters enormously, because when you're dealing with sophisticated partners who actually understand how trade, investment, and resource flows work in practice, theater doesn't just fail, it backfires. Carney understood this immediately. As someone who spent years running the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, he knows that economic claims require economic evidence. When that evidence doesn't exist, the claim isn't just wrong, it's revealing. It tells you that the person making the demand either doesn't understand the system they're trying to manipulate, or they understand it but assume their audience doesn't. From Canada's perspective, both interpretations were problematic. Either they were dealing with economic incompetence at the highest levels of American government, or they were dealing with deliberate bad faith. Neither option suggested that normal diplomatic engagement would be productive. So instead of engaging with the substance of a claim that had no substance, Carney chose to expose the process that produced it. Show Your Work wasn't just a response to Trump's demand. It was a challenge to the entire approach that generated such demands in the first place. And that challenge resonated far beyond the immediate trade dispute. What you saw in the days that followed was something I've never witnessed in 3 decades of observing American foreign policy. Allies, partners, and even neutral countries began explicitly questioning not just American positions, but American competence. Editorial boards in London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo all ran variations of the same analysis. If the United States couldn't produce basic documentation for a $2.88 trillion claim against its closest trading partner, what did that say about its other economic positions? The answer, unfortunately, was that it said quite a lot. Because this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that has been building for years, where American economic diplomacy has increasingly relied on assertion rather than analysis, pressure rather than persuasion, and threats rather than evidence. European officials speaking on background began describing American trade positions as post-empirical. Asian partners started requesting independent verification of U.S. economic data before entering negotiations. Even Mexico, despite its obvious vulnerability to American pressure, began insisting on third-party arbitration for trade disputes. In other words, the institutional credibility that took American diplomats decades to build was being systematically destroyed by leaders who confused volume with authority and mistook stubbornness for strength. And Canada's response accelerated that destruction by making the underlying incompetence impossible to ignore. But the real damage wasn't diplomatic. It was economic. Because when trading partners start questioning your basic competence, they don't just negotiate differently. They plan differently. They hedge differently. They begin treating your market as less reliable, your currency as more volatile, your institutions as more fragile. You can already see this happening in ways that most Americans haven't fully absorbed yet. Canadian pension funds have quietly reduced their exposure to U.S. assets over the past 18 months. European manufacturers are increasingly sourcing critical components from suppliers outside the United States. Not because American products are inferior, but because American trade policy is unpredictable. Asian investors, particularly in infrastructure and clean energy, are directing capital toward projects that don't require American regulatory approval or American political stability. These shifts don't make headlines, but they compound over time in ways that weaken American economic leverage far more than any single trade dispute ever could. And this is where Carney's response becomes strategically brilliant, not just tactically effective. By demanding evidence rather than providing counter-arguments, he forced the conversation onto terrain where Canada held every advantage. Because Canada's trade positions are documented, analyzed, and defensible in ways that American positions increasingly aren't. When Ottawa released its own comprehensive analysis of bilateral trade flows, resource agreements, and investment patterns, it didn't just contradict Trump's claims. It made clear that any serious discussion of economic relationships required the kind of institutional capacity that Canada possesses and America appears to have abandoned. The analysis showed, among other things, that American consumers benefit from Canadian energy exports to the tune of roughly $2.1 billion annually in lower prices. that American manufacturers rely on Canadian raw materials that would cost significantly more from alternative sources, that American financial institutions hold over $400 billion in Canadian assets that provide steady returns, precisely because Canada maintains the kind of regulatory stability that America no longer offers. In other words, the actual economic relationship looks nothing like Trump's fantasy of American victimization. It looks like a complex web of mutual dependence, where Canada provides stability, predictability, and expertise, while America provides market access and capital. When one side of that relationship becomes unstable and unpredictable, the entire structure becomes fragile. The viral moment wasn't just about 3 words. It was about the institutional confidence those words represented. Carney could afford to be dismissive because he knew Canada's position was defensible. Trump couldn't afford to provide evidence because no such evidence existed. That asymmetry tells us something crucial about where American power really stands today. For decades, the United States could make demands based on market size and military capacity alone. Partners would accommodate American positions not because they were always right, but because confrontation was more costly than compliance. That dynamic is breaking down, and not because America has become weaker in absolute terms. It's breaking down because American positions have become less defensible, American institutions less reliable, and American leadership less competent. When your partners start asking you to show your work, they're really asking whether you still deserve the difference you've been receiving. Carney's response went viral because it crystallized that question in the most direct way possible. And the inability to answer it revealed more about American decline than any military defeat or economic crisis ever could. What worries me most as someone who believes deeply in American institutions and American leadership is that this moment was entirely avoidable. The United States has enormous leverage in its relationship with Canada, but leverage only works when it's exercised competently. When you make demands you can't justify, you're not demonstrating strength. You're advertising weakness. The $2.8 trillion figure wasn't just wrong. It was strategically self-defeating. It invited the kind of scrutiny that exposed not just the weakness of American economic analysis, but the weakness of American economic leadership. And once that weakness is visible, it becomes much harder to project the kind of authority that makes diplomacy possible in the first place. History is unforgiving toward nations that mistake arrogance for confidence and bluster for strategy. What happened between Trump and Carney last week wasn't just a diplomatic embarrassment. It was a preview of how American influence erodes when institutions fail and leadership becomes performance rather than competence. But the deeper problem goes beyond Trump's personal limitations or even the current administration's approach to economic policy. What we're witnessing is the systematic erosion of institutional knowledge that once made American economic leadership credible and effective. I've seen this pattern before, in declining powers throughout history. And it follows a predictable trajectory that should alarm anyone who cares about American influence. The first stage is substituting assertion for analysis. When institutions lose their analytical capacity, they compensate by becoming more strident in their claims. The $2.8 trillion demand wasn't just wrong, it was lazy. It represented the kind of economic thinking that assumes conclusions and works backward to justifications rather than building arguments from evidence up. The second stage is confusion about what constitutes leverage. Trump's team clearly believed that market size alone would force Canadian compliance. But market access only creates leverage when it's paired with institutional reliability. When partners can't trust your analysis, your threats, or your commitments, they begin planning around you rather than with you. You can see this happening across multiple relationships simultaneously. European allies are quietly diversifying their defense procurement away from American suppliers. Not because American technology is inferior, but because American export controls have become so unpredictable that long-term planning becomes impossible. Asian partners are building trade relationships that deliberately exclude American participation, not out of hostility, but out of recognition that American trade policy has become too volatile to anchor serious economic partnerships. Even Mexico, despite its obvious geographical and economic exposure to American pressure, has begun developing contingency plans that reduce its dependence on American supply chains and American political stability. This isn't happening because these countries suddenly decided they disliked America. It's happening because American institutions have become unreliable in ways that force rational actors to hedge against American unpredictability. Carney's response crystallized this dynamic perfectly when he said, "Show your work." He wasn't just challenging Trump's mathematics. He was highlighting the institutional gap between countries that still maintain serious economic analysis capabilities and a superpower that appears to have abandoned them. The viral nature of that moment tells us something important about global perceptions of American competence. 3 words from a Canadian central banker generated more international attention and credibility than months of American economic diplomacy. That should be profoundly troubling to anyone who understands how influence actually works in the modern world. What makes this especially painful for someone with my background is that I remember when American institutions set the global standard for economic analysis and trade policy. The Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, the Commerce Department, these were organizations that other countries studied and emulated. Their work product was taken seriously precisely because it was serious work. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It's been a gradual process of political appointees replacing career professionals, ideology substituting for expertise, and short-term political gains taking precedence over long-term institutional credibility. Trump's $2.8 trillion demand represents the logical endpoint of that process. When institutions lose their analytical capacity, they become vehicles for whatever the political leadership wants to hear rather than sources of independent analysis that can constrain or inform political decision-making. Carney, by contrast, represents the opposite approach. His response demonstrated the kind of institutional confidence that comes from actually doing the work, maintaining analytical standards, and building positions that can withstand scrutiny. When he challenged American officials to show their work, he knew they couldn't because he had done his. The Canadian analysis that followed wasn't just a point-by-point refutation of Trump's claims. It was a demonstration of how serious countries approach complex economic relationships. Comprehensive, documented, and defensible, everything that American economic policy has stopped being. The ripple effects of this competence gap extend far beyond bilateral trade relationships. When the world's largest economy can't produce credible analysis to support its major policy positions, it creates uncertainty that affects global markets, investment flows, and economic planning. International investors now factor American political risk into their calculations in ways they never did before. Not because America has become economically weaker, but because American policy has become economically incoherent. Currency markets reflect this uncertainty through increased volatility around American policy announcements. Bond markets price in its price. Higher risk premiums for long-term American debt. Commodity markets react more sharply to American political developments because traders can no longer reliably predict how policy will actually be implemented. This is the real cost of institutional decline. It's not just that America makes bad individual decisions. It's that American decisions become impossible to predict, plan around, or rely upon. Snorts. And in a global economy built on predictability and trust, that unpredictability becomes a form of structural weakness. Canada's response exploited that weakness brilliantly. By demanding evidence rather than providing counter-arguments, Carney forced the conversation onto terrain where institutional competence mattered more than political theater. And on that terrain, Canada held every advantage. The lasting damage from this episode won't be diplomatic embarrassment or even short-term trade friction. It will be the further erosion of American credibility in economic discussions with serious partners. When your closest ally can humiliate you simply by asking you to document your claims, you've lost something more precious than any single negotiation. You've lost the presumption of competence that makes leadership possible in the first place. And once that presumption disappears, rebuilding it requires years of consistent, careful work. The kind of institutional investment that American political culture seems increasingly incapable of supporting. This is why Carney's 3 words matter so much more than their brevity might suggest. They represent a fundamental challenge to the assumption that America can continue to lead through assertion rather than analysis, pressure rather than competence, volume rather than substance. The fact that the challenge came from Canada, America's most reliable ally, makes it even more significant. This wasn't adversarial confrontation. It was friendly intervention, the kind of reality check that only genuine partners provide when they see you heading toward a cliff. The tragedy is that American institutions still have the capacity to do serious economic analysis when they're allowed to function professionally rather than politically. The Federal Reserve, despite political pressure, continues to produce world-class research and analysis. Career professionals throughout the government maintain expertise that could inform better policy if political leadership valued expertise over ideology. But institutional capacity without institutional authority is just academic exercise. When political appointees ignore professional analysis in favor of politically convenient conclusions, the analysis becomes irrelevant to policy, and the institutions that produce it lose credibility both domestically and internationally. Carney's response highlighted this gap between American institutional potential and American institutional performance. Canada doesn't have larger economic resources or more sophisticated technology than the United States, but it has maintained institutional norms that prioritize accuracy over convenience, analysis over assertion, and evidence over ideology. The result is that when serious economic disputes arise, Canada can engage on the merits while America increasingly cannot. That's not a temporary political problem. That's a structural competence crisis that will take decades to address if American political culture ever develops the patience and humility necessary to begin that work. History rarely punishes nations for losing power. It punishes them for refusing to recognize when their approach to exercising power has become counterproductive. What happened between Trump and Carney last week wasn't just a diplomatic embarrassment. It was an institutional wake-up call that American leadership seems determined to sleep through. The question isn't whether America can still demand $2.8 trillion from Canada or anyone else. The question is whether America can still do the work necessary to justify its claims, defend its positions, and maintain the credibility that makes leadership possible in an interconnected world. Carney's 3 words provided the answer to that question, and it wasn't the answer that American policymakers wanted to hear, but it was the answer that American citizens need to understand if we're going to rebuild the institutional foundation that once made American leadership both effective and respected. The path back to credible leadership won't come through louder demands or bigger threats. It will come through the patient, unglamorous work of rebuilding institutional capacity, restoring analytical standards, and earning back the trust that competent governance makes possible.